Hello, History 101 and 17A students. We're covering the Southern Colonies, and this PowerPoint will revolve around the argumentative assignment that I've given you, argumentative assignment number 3. So notice section 1 of that assignment, right? I entitled this Burgeoning Capitalism for Better and for Worse. And I try to make the contention that, that although it was not an enlightened decision to create a land of opportunity on behalf of the English crown, nor by even particularly by the proprietors and joint stock company owners of these colonies, but it came about nevertheless, somewhat organically. So one, right, I tried to make the argument that there were changes in power and influence back in England itself, in Europe. And so Parliament was becoming increasingly powerful. You have to remember that by the 1640s, they will have an English Civil War and the parliamentary forces will prevail. But at any rate, they already are flexing their muscles as a body, as a political body. And many of them, the parliamentary body, the House of Commons, actually, of Parliament, constituted many nouveau riche middle-class people who were not entitled to the same privileges and powers that those of the ancien regime of the old school way, right, connected to the crown, had enjoyed. And this happens quite often in human history, that when a certain demographic starts succeeding very well economically, it will follow that they will make demands for a political voice as well. So you see here in number 1, I try to convey the argument that somewhat organically, what grew was an increasingly free and open market that was developed in English North America, at least relative to the mercantilist standards back in Europe, right? Whereby they wanted to contend that resources are finite and it falls within the power and privilege of the crown to determine how those resources are allocated. Okay, so instead of who you know and being well connected as being your primary avenues to socioeconomic mobility, to having a better life, what we call the American dream later on, now, right, it seems to be open more by merit, relative to mercantilism on paper. So at any rate, looking at this, right, you see in number 1 a sense of King James I in particular. Despite his haughtiness toward Parliament, he had been given a demand on at least one occasion by Parliament to break the monopoly system and to have more economic opportunities opened to more people, right? And so many of these people who take advantage of this are going to be represented in Parliament and generically called the bourgeoisie, the people of the city, right? Merchants, entrepreneurs with their own businesses, financiers, lenders, creditors, etc., right? Artisans, skilled workers, etc. And so when you see here in English North America, firstly, right, the foundations are made for subjectship, for the right to have the rights and privileges of English, what we later call citizenship, although I'm not sure if they use that term yet. So at any rate, under subjectship, right, there had been precedents in the courts under English common law. And one was if you were born in the English realms, and the second one is if it was by blood. In particular, your father was an Englishman, then you were entitled by birth to the rights of an Englishman, whether it be in Virginia or in England proper. So at any rate, the joint stock companies and others, right, who were conceded rights to not only trade and establish trading posts, but to colonize North America, right? Very quickly, they became supposedly desperate for labor. Historian Paul Johnson is big on this, on his history of the American people. But you have to keep in mind, he's a court American historian. He praises the winners and just America in general. And so he's going to omit conveniently much about slavery and other, less favorable facts, etc., right? That might be more of an indictment on the establishment. But at any rate, what he contends, and other historians contend, is that many of the adventurers who put money into these joint stock companies, they didn't want to risk their lives. Why should they? To come over here and do the dirty work. And so they would hire substitutes. And so if you didn't have money, you could agree to come over as an adventurer's substitute, to come to find resources, to establish a relationship with the indigenous, with the Native Americans, and try to garner profit for the company, right? And you would be rewarded as if you had as if you had invested money into the company. So there right away is one example of someone with no capital whatsoever being able to come straight in and earn a profit here in the Americas if he or she could contribute to the company's profits. So at any rate, land, right? Notice this, according to Paul Johnson, free settlers were often entitled to 50 acres of land. They called it oftentimes a freehold, and that goes back to English law. And so it varied, but it was a substantial lot of property. And so, and then of course, the avenue by which someone could arguably rise up the socioeconomic ladder that still is today highly contested is the service of an indentured servant. You had some people, right, like George Alsop and others in Maryland, who contended that this was the perfect scenario. I liken it to like a kid in college, and he's working at a menial job just to help pay for tuition. And he or she has no desire or plans to stay in that menial job, but intends to, once he or she gets the degree, to move on to what he or she considers a more highly paid, prestigious position, right? So it's for now. That was the argument amongst court historians for indentured servitude, that you work for 3 to 7 years often, and then after that you were granted freedom dues, which of course, as you read, entailed land, was supposed to entail land, supplies, you're supposed to have learned a trade, etc., and to get you on your 2 feet. So at any rate, others contend, you look at Howard Zinn and other historians, and they contend that there was almost always a glass ceiling for not just, quote, minority groups, but for poor Englishmen and English women as well. So at any rate, it's arguable, and hence that's the nature of this assignment. But at any rate, you arguably could come here, get access, get citizenship, get access to free land, and get on your own 2 feet, if nothing else, as a cash crop farmer, right? And so at any rate, nevertheless, it did not, this transition, so to speak, right? It was not so radical as to take away the reality that oftentimes it takes money to make money, and that the wealthy have a huge advantage over the less fortunate. So for instance, right, with a headright system, you would receive 50 to 100 acres for every laborer that you could bring over with you as an incentive to bring more laborers here, right? Well, who could afford to bring many laborers? The wealthy, of course. And so the wealthy were very quickly able to ensconce themselves in the Tidewater region of Virginia, and some say arguably monopolize a lot of the seats of power. You read this at the end of the Black Legend assignment, whereby the English gentry class pretty much monopolized the royal council position and the royal governor position of Virginia. And not to mention, they bought up the lion's share of good soil, excuse me, in the Tidewater region. So at any rate, that's why I say capitalism for better and for worse on number 1, okay? Number 2, right? We take a Native American perspective from the Powhatan, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, tribe or confederacy. And so they called so with number 2, we're getting a Native American perspective, right? Revisionist history as opposed to court. And this one, it flips things around, right? Where it states that the Englishmen were very untrustworthy, very greedy, very ungrateful, and very for lack of a better adjective, very pushy and abrasive, right? And so that the Native Americans in this book by Helen Roundtree, right? It's called, it's called Powhatan, Pocahontas, and Opechancanough, Three Lives Changed by Jamestown, by Helen Roundtree. But at any rate, from her perspective, right, which is the Native American perspective, you see evidence that the English came in as the ugly imperialist, right? They come in and look at the orders they're given. They're to create an invulnerable facade, a palisade, a fort, right? Before that they know that the natives realize that you are going to stay there, they said, the Virginia Company, right? Because surely they will, quote, grow discontented with your habitation. So the Virginia Company, the leaders thereof, they had no pretensions as far as they knew they were not going to be welcomed as permanent residents of indigenous Virginia. And they didn't care. They came in to take care of their own first, to protect themselves. Of course, they were told not to provoke the Native Americans and try to have profitable relationship with them, but they were not to order to integrate with them or do anything that would take away from the profits and the best interest of the WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant Jamestown establishment. So notice here, right? They come in and they're uninvited. And notice these different names and different tribes that gave them a warm welcome, right? George Percy wrote and stated that they were even offered as much land as they needed by one of these werewances, one of these sub-chiefs under Powhatan. And so at any rate, right, nevertheless, it seems to be the English from this perspective in this book, who get things going on the wrong foot and on a confrontational manner. A Native American supposedly grabbed a hold of a hatchet, and an Englishman claimed that he was trying to steal it. And very quickly thereafter, things got very tense. Another werewance tried to take a walk with Christopher Newport, whom he seemed to have a good rapport with. And the English soldiers harassed him, according to his account, and made him feel uncomfortable, etc., to such an extent that he's going to advise to Powhatan subsequently to get rid of these Englishmen, that he doesn't trust them, that they seem to pose a threat to the indigenous of Virginia. So at any rate, you're going to have the famous story, and of course this is only written in the True Relation and the Map of Virginia. I'm not sure if that has it as well, but in the books written by John Smith, you got to consider the source. This guy has a reputation for braggadocio, for really trying to promote himself in his books, and so you have to keep that in mind, of course, in reading this primary source written by John Smith of Jamestown. But at any rate, Powhatan, right? What anthropologists believe was that he did not engage in a ritual in which he was going to seriously harm John Smith when he captured him and brought him to his capital, but rather was bringing him through a rite of passage, and that hence John Smith's life was never truly endangered. But at any rate, John Smith was ordered by Powhatan to give him, have a military alliance against the Monacan tribe. This is going to be a common misstep, you might say, in hindsight. Of course, it's easy to look at things in hindsight, right? But Native Americans oftentimes were more preoccupied with a rival tribe than they were with the Englishmen that came into contact with them, at least initially, when Jamestown was so arguably pitiful in its first year or two. So at any rate, he wants access to those weapons that he notices of the English, okay? Namely gunpowder, right, of guns. So at any rate, John Smith goes back on his word. He breaks his promises. He does not provide the arms and ammunition promised to Powhatan. He engages in hunger raids, whereby he extorts the natives, says, give us corn or else, and threatens violence upon them. And then also Nansemond, his territory was encroached upon. He gave an ultimatum. The English did not abide by it, and violence broke out, right? And then also the well-to-do initial leaders of the Jamestown, Virginia Company did not want to build a palisade, a fort, because they thought it would convey the wrong hostile and distrustful image and atmosphere with the Native Americans. And so Captain John Smith didn't care, and he was behind forming Fort Algernon in 1609. And so from this perspective, right, you should notice that the author contends that Powhatan could have wiped out the English if he wanted to for quite some time. But he's depicted with great forbearance, with great sagacity and wisdom, and wanting to try to play the English off of other rivals, etc., learn more about them, bide his time, etc. So the ball was in his court, arguably, and he could have wiped this small settlement out. Even something so superficial as written accounts of the Native Americans' perception of the Englishmen physically. They contended that they were small, pasty, sickly looking, dirty looking, etc. I think that he just didn't feel a sense of, according to this book at least, didn't feel a sense of urgency or sufficiently threatened by them to wipe them out. And of course, in hindsight, Helen Roundtree laments his decision, right? And so at any rate, then I pull 180, right? I pull a 180 on section 3. And I said, you know what? Let's just remind students of the other side of the spectrum, the court history, right? Defending the English. So first of all, I put here, right? Powhatan was no oveja mansa. Oveja mansa, remember, was the meek sheep characterization given by Las Casas of Native Americans. So at any rate, he incorporated, right, 6 new tribes to his confederacy. He also had the Pionkatonks attacked for sharing corn with Jamestown without his permission. And also there was a prophecy, allegedly, that his demise would come from the coast. And according to the written accounts of the Englishmen, they contend that he misinterpreted that threat as the Native American tribes on the coast rather than the English. And so he had the Chesapeake tribe attacked. So he was a shrewd man. He was an imperialist leader who coveted other people's resources, etc., and somewhat lorded power over others when he had the chance. There was also a Don Luis episode prior to this, whereby the Native Americans had the Spanish come in and take some of the Native Americans back with them to Europe. And one was christened with a Christian named Don Luis. But when he came back, he had tricked the Spanish and he had them ambushed. And the Spanish demanded a reprisal and wanted Don Luis, this Native American, to be handed over to them for, quote, justice. And of course, the natives would not do so. So the Spaniards killed their hostages and left with everyone with a very sour taste in his or her mouth. And so notice these Native Americans, you don't get the same depiction as you do like in Columbus's account of the Arawak of the Caribbean, right? Who come out and they're in wonder of the Spanish. They want to touch everything as if they're having a confrontation with aliens from another planet, that they're completely peaceful and childlike, etc. And of course, we've gone into that already. But at any rate, you definitely don't get that encounter here. You get a depiction of Native American tribe that was far from childlike and innocent, but was already very much involved in power politics and struggles for power, even violence and aggrandizement, or taking over and enlarging your territories. So at any rate, right, notice right away, according to the English accounts, the English were attacked. And also on more than one occasion, the English wrote down that the natives would trick them when it came to trade. They would tell them they would like to put all their commodities in somewhat of a canoe and have the English do the same, and each would go to the other's canoe and take what he or she wanted, and they would do it a barter type process, right? But they would tell the English to lay down their weapons when this economic transaction should occur. And people like Captain John Smith said, I don't trust him. Don't lay down your weapons. Well, George Casson was coaxed in supposedly by a couple Native American women, and he was caught and he was brutally killed by the indigenous there. So at any rate, the point being, right, is in American court history, they contend that the English were vulnerable. They came surrounded and distrusted by a group of hostile natives, and that they had to be pragmatic. They had to be practical. They had to be on their toes, so to speak, right? And have a healthy distrust in order to survive. And he contends that Captain John Smith afforded them just that type of sagacity, that those street smarts, that wisdom, and how to deal with people. And so at any rate, John Smith makes empty boasts when he was captured about being a very important person to a very powerful king, and how there would be a great reprisal if they should lay their hands upon him. And author David Price, in his Love and Hate at Jamestown, takes this politically incorrect view, this court history, and contends that dishonesty may have saved Captain John Smith's lives and the lives of other Englishmen. And so at any rate, there was an attack upon Jamestown during negotiations. Opechancanough, the brother of Powhatan, supposedly tried to ambush Captain John Smith, but John Smith was on his toes and preemptively put a pistol to his chest. And so at any rate, you get a much different perspective here. And of course, though, this absolutely negates any accounts from a Native American perspective. It's very one-sided. But like I said, I try to get you guys to critically think on these. And so at any rate, I showed both sides of the spectrum here. All right. So then moving on in Southern Colonies is I make a very provocative, very controversial claim here on number 4, is that racism did not generate transatlantic sub-Saharan African slavery, but that good old-fashioned economics did, and pragmatism, right? And now note, I want to make a disclaimer. What I did not put, because it would not have been convenient to my thesis, was evidence of African Americans being treated differently on account of their color of skin very early in the English colonial record. So for instance, you have Antonio the Negro, that's literally the term they use in the primary sources, Johnson, John Punch amongst runaway indentured servants, and they are treated differently simply because, in special court cases, because of the color of their skin. And not to mention Maryland. Maryland made subjectship changed from emanating from the mother to emanating from the father, and there's good evidence to suggest that they did so almost primarily because they were concerned about white indentured servant girls getting pregnant from African American men, and they wanted to have a punitive measure there so that the slaves, so that the biracial products, children of those unions, would become enslaved and given the status of their father. So at any rate, with that having been accounted for, let's move on here. So notice there is evidence by the mid to late 1600s of suddenly the white pool of indentured servant labor shrinking. There was a great fire in London. Wages increased back in England. Also, an increasing amount of letters were sent by indentured servants conveying how awful the circumstances were and how awfully they were treated. And so for various reasons, they didn't have the same number of available white laborers. You can make the argument. My primary source on this, or not primary source, my secondary source, is The Slave Trade by Hugh Thomas. Okay? So at any rate, what he contends, right, is such, is that there became a scarcity of white laborers, and then not to mention with the indigenous, right? We found this with the Spanish. They called it the great demographic catastrophe, is so many indigenous people died to English and Spanish pathogens that they inadvertently brought with them, that literally the pool of available resources shrunk. Not to mention, many of these English precariously planted initial settlements are doing the best they can to mitigate any type of drama with the Native Americans. And that would have only been exacerbated had they started enslaving them and putting them to work on the plantations. So hence, the indigenous, right, the Native Americans decreasingly came to be viewed as a source of available labor, right? And then, of course, you also have cash crops, tobacco, rice, indigo, sugar, later cotton, right? It's going to be very common in the discourse of that day. It becomes almost an axiomatic assumption is that you need intensive labor to cultivate those crops. You need a lot of laborers. They need to work very arduously, and it's not going to be fun. It's going to be very hard work. And so that's where you get from the time of the Brazilian gold mines to the sugar plantations of Spanish Caribbean and later English Caribbean, is the reputation of Africans for developing a reputation for being very sturdy and to be able to withstand pathogens, to be able to withstand malaria-oriented conditions like great heat, humidity, and being in water. And so they develop a reputation also for being hardy workers and not dying off and getting sick and injured, etc. Right? And then you add to that Bacon's Rebellion. Howard Zinn makes an interesting point when he contends that the Assembly of Virginia, after Bacon's Rebellion, made some declarations that white indentured servant laborers were unreliable and even dangerous. And it was largely going back to a high school kid working a menial job or a college kid working a menial job, but not planning to stay there. Indentured servants had ambitions. They had expectations for their life to improve at the end of their tenure. African slaves did not. So hence, right, African slaves became, in the primary sources, labeled as being more likely to be docile, right? To do as they're told and not expect as much in return for their labor. And so hence, for all these reasons and more, the author of this book contends, and I thought it was an interesting, thought-provoking thesis, is that just economic conditions, an acute need for labor, pretty much instigated, right, fomented slavery. And not to mention also, right, in addition to these things, is the availability and the price of slaves. The Dutch West India Company alone brought over 60,000 slaves from 1650 to 1675 into the Caribbean alone. And so the author of this book is literally going to use the term glut, that there became a larger supply of slaves than was technically in demand. And so hence, like any, quote, sadly, commodity, when you have a much higher supply than demand, the price is going to drop. And already at normal times, according to this source, oftentimes a slave was merely 5 more pounds in price than an indentured servant. An indentured servant you had to let go of as early as 3 years. A slave, you were going to increasingly, with the slave codes being written, have for life, as well as that slave's children. And so, again, it became economically seen as an economically astute and practical decision to go with African laborers when they became more affordable and in larger supply. You had changes, as I wrote in the paragraph, in Africa itself that's going to enhance the supply of slaves as well, and I give some detail on that. So at any rate, let's go ahead and move on. So at any rate, let's see here. South Carolina, number 5. So the term agency, right? The term agency implies that certain groups, according to Marxist and conflict history, they have been, quote, losers in society. They lose politically, where they lose a voice over their own lives and any political power in government. They lose economically. They lose resources, or they lose avenues up the socioeconomic pyramid. And they lose socially, as far as the prestige that's given to them by society, right? So you can make the argument, of course, that Native Americans, African Americans, and early American history were unfortunately, quote, losers in this power struggle, right? And of course, Marxist history and conflict history, very rightly so, try to elicit our empathy in showing how awfully they were treated, right? To the contrary, however, especially with historiography after the Civil Rights Movement, many spokesmen for African Americans and other groups that historically, quote, lost, arguably, in periods of American history, contended, hey, wait a minute, we weren't just passive victims as to what was going on. We were human agents who made decisions that determined our own fate and even determined the fate of other people. And so hence you get the term agency, right? And so you look at areas in which African Americans, like with functional history, they contributed to colonial development, and they did it by their own volition, right? And they made demands, etc. So on number 5, you should see evidence of the early period of South Carolina before it became a royal colony, whereby everything was very precarious. The profits were not coming in. Native American attacks were rife. They were having problems with a type of genus of panther, a Carolina panther, if you will, that was wreaking havoc in the colonies. And mostly they were given orders to engage in labor to bring resources for the company's profits, right? And they didn't have enough hands at the wheel to do the work. So in particular, I mentioned tar and pitch production, right? Where they cut open trees, they allow the sap to accumulate with other sources and develop into tar and pitch. Supposedly, it's a very uncomfortable, very arduous, and even dangerous job that a lot of white laborers did not want to do. So African Americans stepped into this labor scarcity gap, if you will, into this role, right? And said, we'll do this. We'll hunt the panthers. We'll help you fight off the Native Americans. We'll help produce tar and pitch and cut down trees for lumber for the shipbuilding industry. However, we want such and such in return. So increasingly, right, the primary sources indicate that these African Americans were no dummies. They used their agency and said, hey, I'm aware of your need for me, so what are you going to give me in return? And of course, it's no coincidence, says the author of this book called Black Majority, that the number of manumissions of slaves being granted their freedom, or at least partial manumissions, highly increased at this time, because African Americans were smart and shrewd enough to take advantage of this acute need for their labor and demand something in return. Okay? And then we also have Section 6, right, on the awful conditions experienced by slaves, right, in colonial and, of course, later antebellum America. Fogel and Ingerman wrote Time on the Cross. They wrote a book that had a very controversial thesis, right, whereby they said that because slaves were expensive investments, they were treated fairly well, and their conditions weren't especially harsh. Simply not out of humanitarianism, they contend, in their defense, but because of the desire to get as much profit out of their investment as possible on behalf of these slave owners. However, there's just so much evidence to contend against that, right? So you look at evidence in this paragraph, evidence of rebellion in a myriad of ways, passive aggression, working slow, breaking tools, engaging in tasks in the wrong manner, etc., right? And of course, the African Americans are going to fall victim to what was called the Sambo image. And we're going to get into that later on in antebellum history. But they could just say, I'm sorry, master, I'm just a ignorant Negro. What do I know? And so there was a lot of passive aggression that happened and evidence for that. And then overt aggression, right? Overt rebellion. You have multiple cases in the court systems of slaves raising their hand against their overseer or their master, of slaves absconding or running away with some of their master's property, right? You see evidence of these maroon communities of runaways meeting up amongst one another and hiding and developing their own self-sufficient enclaves or communities. And you have advertisements for runaway slaves galore, etc., right? So if conditions weren't so bad, why was there so much evidence of discontent amongst slaves, right? And then, of course, an obvious case of this was the separation of family members, right? Through sale. This happened quite often. As you see in this picture, a dramatic portrayal of that. And I had a very dramatic quote that I began the section with, right? On loved ones being parted from one another. Also, excavations in slave quarters. You have evidence of, and they know the difference between external causes and internal. But there's evidence of key bones and muscles around the shoulders and the hips, etc., being grinded, basically, through very heavy labor. And you also had the skeletons, the prematurely developed skeletons, craniums of African American kids, as a strong suggestion that they suffered from malnutrition. The proverbial soft spot of a baby's head, right, being closed up more quickly when the baby is going through malnutrition. And so at any rate, and then the slave codes themselves, they were so draconian in their punishments, right? South Carolina especially, I gave examples of the first, second, and third instances of running away, raising your hands against a white overseer or master. And notice, right, the argument made that the overseers were put in as hated middlemen over the African slaves, given strict ultimatums. This, and this has to be done in this amount of time. If not, it's your job. And so they were almost set up to be very, very harsh with the slaves, right? And so the slave codes are going to codify this. They're going to ensure that there's not any room for African Americans to literally have mobility, to have rights of recourse for justice, to be freed, to gain their manumission. All of that was secured by these very harsh slave codes. And we'll probably in the future get into some specific slave codes. All right? Then lastly, the Southern Colonies, right? The French Louisiana. So with number 7, you notice the French were somewhat bullied by the indigenous, right? The Choctaw, Natchez, and other tribes dictated terms to the French for the simple reason, according to the source that I'm covering, is that the French did not bring enough men, enough soldiers, enough resources here to be able to impose their will on the Native Americans along the Mississippi River. So instead, right, you get evidence of agency amongst the Native Americans saying, okay, you want us to protect you from the English? What do we get in return? You're desperate for corn and foodstuffs? What do we get in return? And there's evidence of them in times of great emergency, right, of these indigenous allies turning on the French or making last-minute ultimatums saying, oh, you're about to be attacked, etc. We want this, and this in return, or else you can not rely upon our military help or our food, etc., right? And then lastly, number 8, in French Louisiana, the small people, right? The commoners. The argument is conveyed, again, that this was not an enlightened decision made by the French colonial leaders of French Louisiana, right, in the early 1700s, that they wanted to transplant the Ancien regime, life before the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, over to North America, but that it just, the proverbial plant did not grow well in American soil, right? And so instead, they're going to have gender imbalance. So a lot of their young men and soldiers are going to have unions and biracial kids with women of African and indigenous blood, which was never intended, but they're going to grudgingly allow this to happen. Also, many of the immigrants themselves came from rough demographics because the French, for a while, treated Louisiana to a very limited scope, but still, at one point, were looking at it as a penal colony. And so they brought convicts and criminals and sent them over to French Louisiana. So hardly the demographic of people that would be law-abiding to begin with. And then mostly, according to the source that I read, right, the French were almost always short on resources. They did not get the supplies on a regular basis that they either needed or that they wanted and coveted, right? And so to such an extent that Lacombe d'Iberville, Lacombe de Bienville, they're going to pretty much threaten the French crown and say, we're just going to allow smuggling. We have pirates that are providing the goods that we need, and we're not going to punish them. We're going to even allow them to enrich themselves because we need these commodities and you are not bringing them to us. So hence, right, the argument is that French Louisiana became much more fluid. People did as they pleased. They engaged in economic pursuits that were not technically offered to them. They chose to whom they would marry and have unions with, etc. Despite the strict rules that the French tried to lay down to replicate old school France and Louisiana, they just were powerless to do so, right? And so hence, de facto, as things just happened, French Louisiana became more fluid than was France proper. All right. I wish you guys well. I hope you're doing well. I hope this helps. Take care.